two, 1, 2, 3.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Pete Myers. I'm the director of the Tompkins County Workers Center. Just want to let you know this is historically Living Wage Week, International Living Wage Week, so that's why we're doing the updates during this particular week in November going forward. Started in 2003 as the Tompkins County Living Wage Coalition, and very quickly we realized, well, we knew this, that workers have other issues besides not getting paid enough to live. As important as that is, what's people's experience in the workplace? So we started a workers' rights hotline almost right away, and then got people in the door at a higher level to help us effectuate change. We started in 2006 the first in the country living wage employer certification program back in 2006, and now there's a local network around the country, primarily based in the Southeast, North Carolina, Virginia, and such, and that has now sprouted into a national living wage employer certifier called Living Wage for Us that we're very intimate with as well. We update the living wage historically every 2 years with the figures from Alternatives Federal Credit Union, and we've decided to go to every year because workers, when a new living wage comes out, to have to wait 2 years for the new living wage to come out is just way too long. I would like to introduce our first speaker today, aside from myself, Kevin Mitlicki, the president and CEO of Alternatives Federal Credit Union.
I just want to tell you about Alternatives part in this. Back in 1994, we had some employees at the credit union. I wasn't there then, so that's what I've heard. That were saying, hey, you know, the wages that we're making, we're having a hard time getting by. And instead of trying to say, all right, well, here's a 50 cent, $1 an hour raise, at the time, our COO, Lenny Hockman, said, well, let's put some effort into seeing what does it cost to live in Tompkins County. So some people got together back then, and the first living wage study was done in 1994 with the assistance and aid of the credit union, and we've kept involved in it ever since. The credit union is a living wage employer. I think it's very important to do that for our employees. And you know, from someone who runs the business, I look at it as if you're not paying, you know, the wage to the employee, you're paying for it someplace. If you're having employees come to work and they're worried about paying their bills, or they're worried if they're going to have money at the end of the month, or how are they paying for childcare, you're not getting the best work you can get from the employees. Their minds aren't on the job, so you're losing productivity. You're losing something. You're paying for it some way. So very proud that we're able to pay for it by giving it to the employees.
Thanks, Kevin. Our next two speakers will be speaking about the new living wage and give some context and background.
Okay, thank you, Pete and Kevin. Good morning and happy Living Wage Week. Maybe I should say a few words about how the ILR school has been involved in this. So since the 1990s, we have sent undergraduates to help calculate the living wage number with alternatives. I was asked to get involved in this starting in about 2018 with the Tompkins County Living Wage Working Group. That was, it was Pete and Anna Kellis who asked me to do that. It was a group of employers and local activists, elected people and researchers who were talking about the feasibility of making the minimum wage a living wage at the county level. So we produced a report about that, and I mean, we presented it to the legislature in the spring, and I'm really happy that we're doing this because it's a way to kind of keep the conversation going and keep feeding data and research into the living wage discussion locally. In case you're wondering, this year's living wage is $18.45 an hour. So I'm going to make 5 observations about this and then pass it over to Rusty. This is a big increase from last year. It's actually, I've looked at past living wage numbers, and this is the biggest increase that there has been in the period where I can find data. Last year it was 1661, so that's a big increase. So why did it go up? Well, you know, one reason why it might be is that we changed the methodology, and that did lead to a small increase, which is not that surprising because we're looking for a more precise calculation, county specific, of the cost of living here. And so if you get more precise, talking about a county where it's expensive to live, it's not surprising that the number will go up a little bit. But the more important reason is the cost of housing. That has accounted for the vast majority of the increase, and you can find out about that if you look at our report. So the second thing I would like to say is that there are 18,000 people living in and working in our county, 18,000 wage earners who are making under this number. That's about 38% of the wage earners in the county, and this is not that far from past estimates that we have made, or that Rusty has made. So how can this be? We have a tight labor market, low unemployment. How can so many people be making less than a living wage? Well, the thing is, when employers say wages, they have to give people wage increases. It is true that wages are going up. It's just that on average, they're not going up as fast as inflation is. And the big industry around here where wages really lag inflation is education and healthcare. So yeah, average weekly wages are lagging inflation in our big industry. There are some other industries where wage increases have been in line with inflation. The third point I want to make is that disparities by race, ethnicity, and gender, this is the thing that the elected people on the working group and the local activists on the working group were really interested in. These are not going away. So 59% of black wage earners are making less than a living wage. Compare that to about 35% of white workers. It's 50% of Hispanic or Latinx workers. 41% of women are making less than a living wage. Compare that to 35% of men. So there's a lot of work to be done to reduce the inequities in our county's labor market. Fourth point I want to make is that the gap between the minimum wage and the living wage is more than $4 an hour. And this is going to persist because at the end of this year, the minimum wage is going to go up to $15. After that, the minimum wage increases are going to be relatively slow at the state level, much slower than they have been in the past. So the state minimum wage is really going to be of limited use in reducing these disparities on the labor market in Tompkins County. And the final point I want to make is that the cost of living is still much higher in Tompkins County than it is in the surrounding area, and we are able to more precisely quantify it with this way of measuring the living wage than we were in the past. You know, the living wage discussion is in part about wages not keeping up with the cost of living and how we bring them in line with the increasing cost of living, especially for the lowest earners. The pressure on workers and employers, and I guess policymakers too, is quite severe in this context. And so the question is, what are we going to do about it? And that's why we have this number to provide a starting point for action. So I'm going to hand it over to Rusty now.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm Rusty Weaver. I'm also with the Cornell ILR School. I'm based over in Buffalo, so I'm Ian's counterpart over in Western New York. But I'm also the data and numbers guy. So what Ian was saying about changing the methodology for this year and how that may have contributed to the increase that we see in the living wage, the longest table in the report. What this shows you is that in the past, dating back to 1994, when alternatives first began this process with the Living Wage Working Group here in Tompkins County, the focus has been on 9 expenditure categories. If we can figure out how much it costs per month or per year to buy 9 different items, 9 different essential items or basic needs, then we can back into a living wage calculation from there. In the past, this has been done using state and national level data sets from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and one from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. Except for that HUD data set, the BLS data is all effectively the same across New York. But for those of you who are familiar with and are in the living wage world and space, the gold standard, or the most popular set of living wage data out there, is from MIT, the MIT Living Wage Calculator. They use the same data sets that alternatives had been using for almost 3 decades. So again, it's a practice methodology. The only thing is, alternatives beat them to it. They've been doing this since 1994. MIT calculator has only been around really since about 2003 or 2004.
I'm sure everyone got
Yeah, for sure. And so the methodology is consistent across the living wage world. MIT is basically doing the same thing that alternatives had been doing for 10 years prior, just at a larger scale across the nation. Now, why I bring that up is because if you do play around with the MIT Living Wage Calculator and look at living wages across New York State, and you go down and you look at these types of breakdowns, you're going to see the same numbers in different counties. So basically the assumption is that a worker spends the same amount on things like food here in Tompkins County that your counterpart over in Manhattan or New York County would. So those prices don't fluctuate because the data is provided at a statewide scale. So when Ian invited me to join the group this time around and to work on the new calculation, we tapped into Cornell University's official resources. So there are a lot of companies out there, a lot of market research companies that collect tons of data on us every day as we use our phones, as we surf the internet, as we make purchases. But then they also do active surveys of consumers as well, so that they can get a handle on the purchasing community or the buying community, so that they can sell that data to companies, and companies can use that information, everything they know about you, to decide where they're going to invest, what types of businesses they're going to set up, and all of that good stuff. So Ian and I discussed taking that data that Cornell University has a subscription to and access to, and turning it into something for the public good rather than just for private gain and private investment. So we captured that data, which provides spending information down to, in this case, the county scale. So we're no longer looking at expenditure data for all of New York State, but we can see the expenditures vary county by county. And so that's what Ian was saying. It allows us to be a little bit more precise, especially in counties like this, that tend to have higher costs of living than their surrounding areas. So with that, we captured that data in these same 9 spending categories that alternatives had been focused on for the past 30 years. And what we did is, just to ensure that it's not this change of data or this change of methodology that's causing the rise in the living wage, we calculated the living wage using that same method for 2022 and 2023. And so in this very long table, to go along with the long way that I'm explaining this, the living wage last year officially in Tompkins was $16.61. When Ian and I went back and made the calculations using our localized data for Tompkins County for 2022, the wage would have been $16.84. So we're not talking about a huge difference. We're not talking about this localized data being the cause of this jump that we're seeing in the wage. Back then it was about a 20-cent difference, basically. And so we just wanted to do that as a proof of concept to show that if we do use the localized data, we're on the same page that alternatives had been on for 30 years, but this gives us an opportunity going forward to really drill down and look at what folks in Tompkins County are spending their money on, their hard-earned money on. And so with that being said, that table, the long table, shows you what the living wage would have been with this method last year versus what it is today, which is the $18.45 that Ian mentioned. Now on that is basically the living wage, where we're assuming this is for an individual worker with no children, no roommates, no one else in the house. This is sort of the bare bones living wage for a single worker in Tompkins County. to really justify why the costs seem to have gone up so much year over year compared to prior years, we also really focused on throughout the report, I won't bore you with it, you can read it on your own time, the cost of housing. Like Ian said, that is the primary driver for this big increase. The cost of housing, which the data comes from HUD, it looks at the fair market rent for a one-bedroom unit in Tompkins County. That number jumped between 2022 and 2023 by 14%. That's a pretty large increase for the cost of housing. And it turns out that we didn't incorporate this into the study because this is the 2023 living wage, but HUD's 2024 estimate for fair market rent for a one-bedroom in Tompkins County is out, and it's up by another 10%. So this isn't a problem that's going away. The cost of housing is really rising, and that is why we're seeing such a big increase in the living wage for Tompkins County. In the back end of the report, just as another way of sort of making this case, we also give you 3 other versions of a living wage. The official one, again, following the practice methodology, is $18.45, but we also give you the counterpart wage from the MIT calculator for a single adult with no kids in Tompkins County, which is basically the same number, it's $18.47. But then we also give you 2 what are called housing wages. This is a concept that was put out by the National Low Income Housing Coalition. It's basically the cost that you would need so that you're not housing cost burden, the wage that you would need so that housing occupies only 30% of your gross income and no more. And that, for Tompkins County, varies between about $22 and $24 per hour. So that's much higher, and again, it's showing you how housing is really driving this upward surge that we're seeing in the living wage. The last point that I'll make is there is a map in this document, but what we do is we compare the living wage that we computed for Tompkins County to the living wage in all of the surrounding areas. So we selected, there are basically 24 counties in that map, 22 of them. Those counties are associated with, according to the New York State Department of Labor, right now we are in the southern tier labor market region. So we compared the wages in all of the counties in that labor market region, as well as in the connected or adjacent regions of the Finger Lakes labor market region and the Central New York labor market region. Of those 22 counties in the vicinity of where we are, both the living wage and cost of living in Tompkins County is the highest. So that's just sort of reinforcing Ian's point that the minimum wage isn't going to help get rid of these issues. Costs are continuing to rise, and you already have a higher cost of living than most of your neighbors. And so that is why I think we're here with elected partners to talk about what can be done outside of the statewide minimum wage.
Thanks so much, Rusty and Ian. I feel so blessed that we have you and the collab doing these studies, because it just brings a much different, deeper level to what it should be, the living wage. Our next speaker comes to us. I've known him for quite a while, Eddie Moran. I knew him with a previous employer, vis-a-vis the Workers Center, and he's now the Senior IT Support Specialist at Alternatives Federal Credit Union, talking about his experience with wages.
My name is Eddie, and it's been about 5.5 years now since I have last had full income based on minimum wage, and I'm slowly recovering. It has changed my life, and I know that may sound a bit extreme. Before I was at Alternatives, I was doing the average minimum wage hustle, had 2 jobs, minimum. I worked on average 7 days a week, and it was brutal. There were days and times where I was literally doing 3 jobs just because I had to worry about a car repair, or I ended up in the hospital for something, and I'm like, oh great, that's another $500 bill that I don't have the money for. And it took a huge toll on my health, on my physical health, mental health, emotional health, for those of you that count that as a statistic. And since I've been at Alternatives, my credit has increased, and that's not because I work at Alternatives, I assure you. It's primarily because now I've been able to actually afford to pay off the debts that I committed to. Give you guys some scope of what I had been struggling through. My very first car that I had gotten on a car payment, I ended up on the verge of getting repoed. And that was all because I didn't know that there had been something wrong with my taxes from years ago, and the IRS was coming after me for that. And now, suddenly, I had no idea what I was going to do. And in large part, a huge factor to me being able to overcome that situation was I was working at a living wage job. So I was already paying off the bills that I had throughout the year. I now was able to actually qualify for a loan to help me get the minimum things that I needed to get done. I mean, even a car. So I'm sure many people watching this have experienced the beater syndrome, where you just buy whatever car you can afford, and then you just duct tape it until you can get a better car. That was me. I was the guy duct taping my muffler every 50 so miles because the duct tape ran out. That was me. And now I have a newer car. And that's because I can afford the car payment. And just the mental relief of knowing that when I go to my car in the morning, it's going to turn on is monumental. I mean, I'm not concerned about my car turning on anymore. I have health insurance, so go figure. I can actually afford to go to the doctor now. I mean, even something as mundane as keeping my cell phone up and running has not been an issue, where before, some months you catch me with my phone on, some months you gotta email me, because that's the only way you're gonna get through to me. I mean, it's been absolutely incredible. So before I started Alternatives and had a living wage job, I was, again, working 7 days a week, minimum 2 jobs, and my car, I was changing every other year or so, just because that was what I could afford. Now, and I was renting the bare minimum room, not a 1-bedroom, not a 2-bedroom. It was often I was in a suite of 4 people's, a 4-bedroom, and that's what I could afford. Now, I have a home. I have a new car, right? Like, I have food in my fridge, not anybody else's fridge. I get to go home, and the home is the way I left it. I don't have to worry about roommates. I don't have to worry about the drama of housemates. It's been absolutely fantastic. And I mean, I do recognize that a lot of that is from my trials and tribulations and me doing what I need to do to get by. But a large part of me having the ability to get to this point was knowing that I had a living wage employer, so that at the end of the week, I don't have to take a second job just to make the bills meet, right? I could take a second job if I want to get ahead. And that is a huge difference in lifestyle. And yeah, I fully support having a living wage job, and I can speak all day if anybody ever wants to talk to me about the importance of having a living wage job.
As many of you know, this past January, I will say for myself, I felt blessed. I'm sure that many of you were blessed as well that we had a new state senator in town, Leah Webb. Kind of a deal breaker, a difference maker. We are blessed today to have Leah Webb's Chief of Staff with us today.
Yes, my name is Stacey Demas. I am Chief of Staff to State Senator Webb, and I'm here representing her. And she wanted me to relay her gratitude for being invited, and the wonderful work and effort to really bring this important issue to light. And I really appreciate your story and your honesty. And I think the one thing I wanted to highlight also is the importance of having electeds that understand that struggle. Me personally as a staffer definitely understands that struggle. One of the highlights that were number 3 of women of color or people of color, and then being a woman, me and Leah definitely understand the discrepancy. We didn't really need to study for it. We're glad that the data matches what we personally have experienced in our lifetime, so that's always very nice.
Our next speaker is definitely an elected who understands the struggles that workers face. It's my pleasure to introduce County Legislator Veronica Pilar.
Like you said, it's very, very helpful to have a clear number and a clear methodology behind it to point to when trying to make policy decisions. I want to highlight again a couple things that some people have already said. One, the racial and gender disparities in rates of people getting paid living wage and not A lot of folks are very excited at working on economic justice and trying to ease economic anxieties, and maybe don't want to pay attention to racial justice, but achieving racial justice is inherently part and parcel of achieving economic justice, because, and we can see that it has to be because of the disparities laid out here. Similarly, if we want to work for racial justice, achieving economic justice, fair wages for everyone, is part and parcel of that because of these disparities. I also want to appreciate folks who have shared aspects of what the cost of not paying a living wage is. It's easier to come up with the cost to live here, and from, say, an employer's perspective, to look at, oh, how much more money am I going to have to pay if I have to pay all my employees a living wage? That is a fairly easy number to calculate. What is harder to calculate, but is just as real, is the cost to community members, to governments, to even employers themselves, of not paying a living wage. You see it in, I mean, for an employer side, you see it in more labor turnover, more, employees who are not able to sustain stable lives outside of work, and they're not able to show up to work happy or consistently, and it's not because they're doing anything wrong, it's just they're not able to. Eddie, everything you shared also is like the added costs of not getting paid a living wage. I really appreciate your vulnerability there, because it's not just the amount of money, that just having that much less money, but the troubles you run into, the anxieties, the emotional tolls, the debt you get into that then mounts, the having to get the cheapest thing that then breaks and repair it. It's expensive to be poor, basically. And that adds up. Someone is paying that price. And finally, if folks aren't able to make their own lives work on the wages they get, there's some amount of government services that can step in and support, but that's expensive too for everyone involved. Not so much the money, but the systems of means testing and forms and waiting in line and just all the huge amounts of work that goes into that. We would need so much less of it if everyone who is working was paid a living wage for their work. There was a push at some point for a Tompkins countywide minimum wage being a living wage. You can see the evidence on their table, and it's been a little dormant for a while, but I would love to see that happen again.
It may be coming back very soon.
Fantastic. So really open to hear your ideas, work with you all. One last comment. I know, Rusty, you mentioned that in the county map that the Tompkins County living wage was the highest in the region. But it's also important to note every single county had a living wage that is higher than the state minimum wage. So even among all this variation in the region, the state minimum wage is not enough, even now, even for our lowest cost of living neighbors.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.